Hello, and welcome to HHH, the podcast where we talk about those horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and if you guys are liking these spooky stories, these stories of these horrible people who murder and torture and, do all the fun stuff, be sure you're sharing this with all of your friends and family that love this kind of stuff. Make sure you're liking, subscribing, all of that cool stuff. Also, be sure to check out Instagram so you can see pictures of these terrible people and some of the things that they've done. I try and keep it clean. Don't worry. I won't show you anything too crazy, but make sure you're checking that out. Now, today, we're talking about something that, in my personal life, I am connected with in a roundabout way. I'll explain that in a second. But we have all seen the fairy tales, heard the stories, where the villain of the story is the evil, jealous stepmother who just can't stand her stepchildren and will do anything to get them out of the way. Specifically, I think of Snow White or like Cinderella or stories like that where the stepmother's just the worst. Well, the individual we're going to talk about today is probably the most evil stepmother ever to exist. As a stepmother of 5, this is how I'm connected to this. I have 5 stepkids who are the best, most amazing kids in the world, and I love them with all of my heart. And I cannot imagine doing what this woman did to her poor stepchildren. And I put stepchildren in quotation marks. I'll explain that in a minute. But I just can't. Because I love them like they're my own kids. I don't know how she could possibly do what she did. So join me today as we talk about the first woman to be legally hung, the second woman to ever be hung, and the last woman to be hung in Western Australia. Today we are talking about a woman that was so evil that they saw only fitting to bury a serial killer on top of her. And if you haven't listened to the episode about Eric Edgar Cook, you should definitely do that because it's a pretty good one. But today we're talking about Martha Rendell, the evil, evil stepmother, Martha Rendell. So let's jump into her twisted tale. It's gonna be good, guys. I know what you guys are thinking. I know you're thinking, wow, Angela, your voice is so sultry and amazing. What have you done? Well, guys, I'm telling you, getting sick will do that to you. So don't mind my raspy, deep voice this week. It's just a little congestion. Hopefully it'll go away next week. But let us dive in to Martha Rendell's story. So Martha Rendell was born August 10th, 1871 in Hope Valley, South Australia. She was actually born to a very poor family and would have received a very small amount of education and schooling, mostly because we know this information, mostly because of the situation in Australia at the time. A lot of her background is very shrouded in mystery. We don't know tons and tons of detail, but in the 1890s, Australia was in a really deep, deep depression. Like, everyone was struggling to feed their family, living in little shacks. Think of the depression here in the United States. It was pretty bad, and that's kind of what Australia was going through in the 1890s. Many men were leaving their families to go and try and find any possible way to earn money to keep them fed. So a lot of husbands were just abandoning their wives, just searching for a way to provide for themselves and hopefully their family. Now, what we do know about Martha is Australia had mandated that all children go to school at least until the age of 13. So we know she went to school at least till she was 13 years old. We also know she was born to an incredibly poor family just because of the depression that the country was in. We also know that she was known for her loose morals. She was kind of a social outcast because she did not conform to the standards set for women at the time. And at this time period, like during this time period, the expectations for a woman was to become a wife and a mother. Women in this time period were very, very dependent on men. They could not earn their own money. They could not be very independent. So Martha kind of like bucked these trends and was very independent, didn't like to fall into those stereotypical women situations. She didn't want to become dependent on a man. But in this time, it was kind of necessary for survival. You couldn't survive unless you were dependent on a man. So she was kind of a social outcast because of her loose morals and being willing to sleep around with men and do things that were not considered to be very ladylike. Like, for example, in Australia, this is how the situation was at this point in time. Women in Western Australia didn't get the vote until 1899, if that kind of gives you a hint of what women were kind of dealing with at this time. So it was very difficult to be a woman, and she was ostracized for not falling in line, right? So at the age of 16, she actually left home and had 3 children out of wedlock. Like I said, she didn't mind sleeping around and ended up having 3 children outside of wedlock, which was a huge no-no at this time. Like, oh my gosh. The judgment that was probably cast upon her, like if she was a social outcast before, having these 3 children would have doomed her socially. So when she was in her 20s, she actually started having an affair with a married man named Thomas Nichols Morris. Now, these two were neighbors, and how it started is they just kind of started chatting, like talking to each other. And all the neighbors kind of started noticing that they were hanging around each other quite a bit. And obviously the rumor mill started saying, oh, they're having an affair. They're having an affair. Oh my gosh, da 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 da. You know how people chit chat. Well, the rumors started flying. And it turned out that they were true. So they were having an affair. And these rumors were stressing out Thomas Nichols' wife. He was married. He had 9 children. Let me reemphasize that. 9 children. And he was married. The reason why this affair caused his wife, Sarah, to have a lot of stress, not only is it horrible and awful to be cheated on by your spouse, but at that time period, it was socially devastating. People would shun you and think you were morally unclean. Like, it was just the judgment at that time, oh my goodness, was insane. So Sarah was aware of the affair and kind of gave him an ultimatum, like he needed to end it. So he actually moved his family all the way to Perth in 1900 to get away from the scandal and try and start afresh, start new, rejuvenate his relationship with his wife, because the rumors were just getting out of hand and it was kind of destroying their life. And majority of the reason why they moved was because of the affair. But it also gave him a chance to find better opportunities for work. Like I mentioned, they were in a pretty deep depression, so they were trying to find work. So his marriage was already super rocky when they moved to Perth. But just imagine this, how things went when Sarah found out that his mistress, Martha, had also moved across the country to follow him to Perth. And not only did Martha move across the country to Perth to be with Thomas, she abandoned all 3 of her children to do so. And when Sarah found out about this, specifically about her abandoning her own children to be with this man, Sarah had had enough. She was done. Martha, when she moved to Perth, became a domestic servant to a wealthy family to afford living there, and almost immediately started pursuing Thomas. Like, didn't even hesitate. She knew. See, this is what bothers me about this woman a lot. Because she knew this man was married. She knew he had children. She didn't care. She was going to break him up. Her dream was to become Thomas's wife. And she was not going to stop till that happened. It didn't matter that he already had a wife. She was determined. And people like that make me so angry. So angry, because there are plenty of men out there. Go get somebody else. Why ruin Sarah's life? It's not Sarah's fault. You didn't do anything. So Sarah had enough when she found out that Martha and Thomas had resumed their relationship, because the whole reason they moved to Perth was to start over. And start over they did. They started their affair over. So she couldn't actually divorce Thomas at this time. Again, the judgment, the social standing, it was crazy, guys. Like, I can't even express the amount of control like society had on people. They could not get divorced. So they just separated. They never officially divorced. So they were married throughout the rest of this story, legally married. So Martha and Thomas never were officially legally married. Now, Thomas was granted custody of his 5 youngest children. Remember, I said he had 9 kids. So he got the 5 youngest children, which is super interesting because nowadays it's almost like a default that the mother gets the custody of the children, which, you know, can and can't be good things. Like, it just depends on the situation. But back then, it was more likely that the father would actually get custody of the children because he was the one actually providing and bringing in the money. No matter what the situation was, he could have been a drunk, horrible, awful person. He could have still gotten the custody of the children. Now it's most likely the mom that will get custody almost no matter what. But different situation or different thing to talk about on a different day. So at this point in time, Thomas gets custody of his 5 children. And him being able to keep custody of those 5 children would eventually prove to be a deadly decision on that part of the government. They made a poor decision by giving him the custody of these children. But they didn't know it at the time. Thomas didn't know it at the time. But Martha almost immediately moved in the second Thomas's wife moved out. It was exactly 10 years. This affair had been going on for 10 years. And she moved in almost exactly 10 years after the affair started. And to avoid embarrassment, because like I said, social standing was very important, they moved again to a place where no one knew the situation. And no one knew that they weren't married. So she started becoming known as Mrs. Morris. And she required the children to call her mother so no one would be suspicious that they weren't this happy-go-lucky family. So they moved. Martha's now quote-unquote Mrs. Morris. And this is why I said they're quote-unquote her stepchildren, because they never were officially her stepkids. Because Thomas and her never actually got married. Now, in Martha's mind, she really romanticized this relationship with Thomas. She believed in like the white picket fence and things were going to be just magical and beautiful and so wonderful once they were finally able to get married and she was able to get rid of his pesky wife. Well, it was like that for a little bit, but after a while, the honeymoon phase ended, and it ended pretty abruptly. Because, like I said, at this time, financially, most Western Australians were struggling. And that included them, Martha and Thomas. Thomas had to work super long hours, which left Martha to care for the home and now 5 children who, shockingly, resented her for what she did to their family. Like, these kids hated her because of what they did, what she had done to their family. She tore their family apart. And now they're required to call her mother, and she's there to care for them while their father's gone for super long hours. These kids probably despise this woman because, I mean, I don't blame her. She was a freaking homewrecker. So these guys were not wealthy. Thomas and Martha could not afford to hire a nanny. They couldn't afford to hire help or anything like that. In fact, they lived in a pretty ramshackle home themselves, like barely making it by, barely able to feed their kids. Well, I should say Thomas's kids. So Martha, in addition to not being able to afford help or a nanny or any kind of help for the children, Martha probably wouldn't have wanted anyone from the outside to come into the house because they were presenting themselves as this happy family and she was married to Thomas and these were her children and all of that kind of stuff. But the truth was they were not legally married. In fact, she was a homewrecker that had destroyed this family, and she did not want this information getting out to the public because they were living a lie, and she was so terrified people would discover the truth about their immoral lifestyle. Because at this time, living with someone that was not your spouse, having relations with someone that was not your spouse was just horrific and like the worst thing possible. So she did not want the truth to get out. So they didn't want any outside anyone coming into their home, which also left Martha super isolated and she couldn't make friends because she was too afraid to make friends with any of the neighbors because she was terrified the truth would get out and the rumors would start and everyone would start talking and they would eventually have to move again because it would destroy them socially. So she just never made any friends. She was just alone and taking care of these children that were thrust upon her. I mean, she did that to herself, but anyways, so she was very lonely and I could see how this would start taking a very severe mental toll on her because the dream of the fairy tale ending was coming crashing down all around her and reality of life was starting to sink in. So during this isolating period of her life, there was a diphtheria outbreak and it struck all of Perth. Now, diphtheria is a bacterial infection that spreads through droplets in the air or sores and ulcers. So it's a pretty nasty disease. You'd get fevers and chills and like cough and like it was not great. And it was to the point where it wasn't super curable. Nowadays it's pretty curable. Most people, if you get diphtheria, it's most likely you'll be fine. But back then it was not the case. They did not have the medications. They didn't have the medical help that is available now. Like, it was so severe that Queen Victoria's own daughter died of diphtheria. And if I remember correctly, I think her nephew or grandson also died of diphtheria. And that was Queen Victoria. She had all the money. She had all the connections to the best doctors, the best everything. Well, when this diphtheria broke out in Perth, everyone was too poor. Like, it was expensive to call the doctor. So it was rare to get help and to get anything that could actually help. So if the Queen's own daughter died of this, the common people didn't really have a chance. So Olivia, Annie, George, and Arthur were 4 of the children, and they ended up getting sick in 1907 with diphtheria. Now, they called the doctor. Dr. Cuthbert actually came and gave all the children anti-diphtheria toxins. It sounds like really bad, but it's basically medicine to help get better. It sounds like he's giving them toxins or like something toxic. That is not what it is. It's like medicine. And he also gave them other things to kind of relieve their sore throats, because that was probably the worst part of the diphtheria, is you would get such sore throats that you couldn't swallow, you couldn't talk. It just hurt so bad. Now, these anti-diphtheria treatments needed to actually be swabbed on the back of the children's throat, and they hated it. They said it was excruciatingly painful, and it would make it so that they genuinely could not talk. Now, Martha was the one that would put the stuff on the back of the children's throats. And the doctor said that often on his visits, he would see Martha nursing her stepchildren back to health. She was always by their side. She would swab the medicine, which was called, quote, spirits of salt, unquote. Would you like to know what spirits of salt or spirits of salts, there's an S on the end of that. You want to know what that is? I looked it up. It's hydrochloric acid. Yeah. She was putting hydrochloric acid on the back of their throats to try and ease the pain. But it didn't seem to help. Now, I think about when I've had sore throats or like strep throat or something where my throat really hurts. The thought of putting hydrochloric acid on it, oh my gosh, I just got chills like thinking about that. That sounds awful. So no wonder why the kids didn't like it. It was super painful, and it doesn't sound super healthy. But she claimed that's what the doctor told her to do. But I will say back then, because people were super poor, they always tried to find home remedies for things like this. And I think the spirits of salt were a home remedy. I don't know if it was ever actually something prescribed specifically by the doctor. If he said, well, you could try this, it might help. So just a little side note there, like, because they were so poor, this could have been a home remedy that she was trying on her own and not necessarily prompted to by the doctor. I don't know for sure, though. So 9-year-old Annie seemed to be getting the illness the worst. And she actually would have convulsions and diarrhea and vomiting. And eventually, on July 28th of 1907, she actually would pass away. The cause of the death was, on the death certificate, was, quote, a combination of epilepsy and cardiac weakness. What? Okay. So cardiac weakness. That's interesting to me. Was that like a heart attack or just heart couldn't handle it? So she died July 28th, 1907. The 3 other siblings that had gotten the illness seemed to start getting better from the diphtheria. Despite the loss of Annie, they all started to kind of get back to normal in the household, and things started running slowly back to normal. But only 1 month later, 1 month, that's it. 1 month later, Olivia, George, and Arthur were all sick again. But this time, they had all contracted typhoid. Now, typhoid, I'm telling you, at this time period, there are so many illnesses and craziness going on. You've got a depression, you've got diphtheria, and now you've got typhoid. This disease was responsible for killing a ton of people throughout Australia. 2,000 people died in the 1900 epidemic of the typhoid outbreak. And they actually think that number is probably even higher. But 2,000 people. And with her body already being so weakened from the diphtheria that she had been fighting, 5-year-old Olivia, or Olive, did I say Olivia? It's Olive, actually passed away on October 16th, 1907. So she had fought the diphtheria and then almost instantly got the typhoid illness, and it did her in. So in June of 1908, so, just a few months later, Arthur began to suffer vomiting, diarrhea, and a sore throat. They actually couldn't determine where the sore throat was coming from. So, again, Martha was super vigilant, adding the quote-unquote medicine to the back of his throat to ease the pain, but Arthur just seemed to get worse and worse and felt worse after every single treatment. And Arthur would end up passing away on October 6th, 1908. So he was sick from June to October before he passed away. And he passed away almost exactly a year after his little sister passed away. Now, with 3 children dying in the same household, the doctor started getting a little bit suspicious. It's interesting to me, with Jolly Jane, it was, oh, wow, this is kind of weird. Multiple people died in the same household. I wonder if something's going on. And that's kind of the same situation we have here is, 3 children in such a short amount of time. This is fairly odd and a little suspicious. So the doctor actually requested that he be able to do an autopsy on Arthur after he had passed away. Now, this is the weird part, is when he requested this, it wasn't Thomas that insisted he was there. No. Martha insisted that she had to be present during the autopsy. She wanted to be in there watching them as they did the autopsy on Arthur, which I find fairly odd and, a little bit suspicious. Because why would she need to be in there if she hadn't done anything? She should be fine just letting him kind of go for it and do his own examination. But she insisted that she be there, and she was in the room when this took place. So she sat back and watched the doctor, and the doctor actually didn't end up finding anything. He said that everything looked pretty normal and ruled the cause of death as hemorrhage and ulcers of the bowels and cardiac failure. Now, keep in mind, the hemorrhaging ulceration of the bowels, keep that in mind. That is important a little bit later. So, in April of 1909, so just a couple months after Arthur had passed away, 15-year-old George disappeared and went missing. And the Morris neighbors obviously got really suspicious and really nervous because 3 children had already passed away in their household, and now another child is missing. And they hadn't seen him around for quite a while. And when they would ask Martha and Thomas about it, they would give very vague, unclear answers like, well, I don't know where he's at. I don't know. He could be anywhere. I don't know. basically like, I don't know, I don't care. And so the neighbors got really nervous and very suspicious of what had happened to 15-year-old George. So there was an investigation launched to try and find George. And good news, they found him alive and he was at his mother's house. And it turns out he had actually run away from home. And his reasoning and the story he told police shocked them and surprised them in not a great way. So he told the police that his siblings had not died of the illnesses that everyone believed they had. He said that Martha had killed them and that Martha was responsible for their death because she poisoned them. He said that instead of actually putting medicine on the back of their throats, that she was painting their throats with the hydrochloric acid. So, and he called it the spirit salts. And that to me makes it sound like this was not something that the doctor had told her to do. It sounds like something she was doing on her own. But he said that it was the hydrochloric acid that was making their throats hurt and it would make it so much worse. And the reason why he ran away from home was because Martha had actually given him a cup of tea that had made his throat very sore. And he was scared that Martha was now targeting him and trying to kill him. So he ran to his mother's house. Now, this claim and this story to the police actually would trigger an investigation because they were already kind of suspicious because 3 children in one household. So with the story from George, they started an investigation. And they found that Thomas and Martha had actually purchased a really large amount of hydrochloric acid while the children were ill, but hadn't bought any more after the death of Arthur. So it was kind of weird that they were buying a bunch, and then Arthur passes away and nothing. So that seemed a little suspicious to the police. And there was a witness, one of the neighbors actually claimed that he had seen Martha swabbing Arthur's throat through the window and had heard him screaming in pain and crying out for help. And the neighbor said that he saw Martha sitting on her rocking chair in glee as she heard Arthur screaming in pain. And it seemed that she was deriving an immense amount of pleasure from his pain and anguish. Now, this is a witness. How true the story is, we don't know, but the police took it pretty seriously. So, on July 3rd, 1909, all 3 of the children's bodies were actually exhumed, and the medical examiner noticed a commonality where all of them had hemorrhaging and inflammation in their bowels. Just like Arthur, the other 2 had the same thing, and they supposedly both, or 2 of the 3 of them, had died of diphtheria, and 1 of them had died of a completely different illness. So the fact that all of them had the same injuries, internal injuries to their bowels was kind of telling. And they also found traces of the hydrochloric acid on their throats when they did some testing. So to make sure that the hydrochloric acid was what would have caused the issues in the bowels, they actually ran some tests on guinea pigs and rabbits and found that applying the acid to their throats actually had the same effect as it did on the children. So they knew, like, okay, she must have been poisoning them with this because it's killing them, these animals, in the same way that the children died. So the evidence found in their testing was enough to get Martha and Thomas arrested. So both of them were arrested, and their trial began December of 1909. The prosecution described Martha as a wicked, evil stepmother who abused and eventually killed her stepchildren. And it's fair to say that at first her relationship with the children was cordial, but over time, as the children became more resentful and more resistant to her, her punishments became harsher and harsher. And at one point, she even beat Annie so thoroughly that Annie was unable to walk. So it is proven that Martha was a pretty abusive stepmother. And when the children would try and stand up to her, it would just make the situation even worse. And I think that's part of what drove her to her murderous ways, is she just couldn't take it anymore. Like, the children were in her way. They were the barrier to her happiness with Thomas. And she just couldn't handle being a parent anymore. Didn't want to deal with it. Or at least that's kind of how the prosecution described it. And they even painted her as like, if she could get rid of these children, she could finally be alone with the man that she followed across the country to be with, and apparently was even willing to kill for. So they kind of painted her as this like crazy, like obsessed woman over this man. And they even claimed that she delighted in watching the children die and even got some sexual pleasure out of it. Now, I want to point out at this moment something that I just find so intriguing. If you've listened to a lot of the episodes, all the women, out of all the horrible people that we've done, all the women seem to be the people that are getting off on killing people. What the heck? I always just assumed it would always be the men. That's what they enjoyed. But it's only been the women thus far. It's so crazy to me. Anyways, that's just a side note that I wanted to point out, that my goodness, these women, they're freaking crazy. So they made claims that she was pleasured off of watching these children suffer and die, which is just horrendous. Now, the evidence was not super strong against her. The people performing the autopsy claimed that they had found the hydrochloric acid in the children's throats, but it was very unlikely that this was actually the case because of the decomposition of the bodies. Like, they pulled these bodies out, like a couple of them, it was like a year or more after they had died. So it probably was actually really hard to really test that. And, tests and science weren't as far and advanced as they are now. I think now if they were able to run these tests and do these things, they would have been able to definitively say what caused the death of these children. They would be able to say for sure if the acid was in there. But back then, these tests were not phenomenal. So the evidence was a little flimsy. But the people of Perth, despite not having strong evidence, were absolutely convinced of her guilt. The press painted her as a scarlet woman and a wicked stepmother. So the public was outraged at her crimes. And it didn't help her case that a woman had actually just been charged with killing her stepdaughter by beating and working her to death. So they already had a pretty negative view of stepmothers. There were also a slew of baby farms that had been discovered across Australia. And we all know how baby farming went. Amelia Dyer, anybody? If you haven't listened to that one either, make sure you check that one out, because baby farms are the worst. So needless to say, the public was very weary of women who were not actually the children's mother and who were caring for the children. They were very hesitant to believe the innocence of Martha, but they were very quick to believe that she, in fact, killed her stepchildren. So Thomas Morris was actually acquitted of the death of his children. After he was released, he absolutely stood by Martha's side, claiming that she was innocent, saying, quote, "I say fearlessly before God, I was innocent, and so is Martha Rendell. She may have appeared hard outwardly, but no woman ever had a more tender heart than she." Unquote. So he fully backed her. And I don't know if it was because he was smitten and just deeply in love with her or what, but I feel like if my children had been had died and it seems like someone had murdered them, I would be a little skeptical, but he absolutely stood by her. Now, the jury actually found her guilty of killing Arthur. They didn't charge her with the murder of the other two children. They just charged her for Arthur's murder. And the judge described her as a human monster and a moral deformity. So they really did not like Martha. Now, she claimed her innocence all throughout her trial and even after she was sentenced. She claimed that she had not done what they had claimed that she had done. Like, she was genuinely just taking care of the children and wanting to help them. And it was unfortunate that they died, but she was not the cause of the death. That is what she claimed all throughout her trial and even after. So 20 days after her sentencing, exactly 1 year, exactly 1 year to the day after her stepson's death, on October 6th, 1909, at Fremantle, sorry, I forgot a letter in that, Fremantle prison, Martha was hung for her crimes. Now, like I mentioned, she was the first woman in Western Australia in 38 years to be hung, and the only woman to actually be legally hung. So I'm curious who the other woman was that was hung, because apparently it wasn't a legal thing. They just hung her for no good reason. And Martha was the only woman to legally be hung in Western Australia. And she was the last woman to be hung. And it made her one of 2 women to be executed in the 20th century in Australia. Only 2 women, and Martha was one of them. Now, this story was really interesting to me because the more I learned about it, the more I had some questions. Like, did Martha actually kill her stepchildren? So, this is a question, like, is she guilty or is she not? To me, it feels like I mentioned, the evidence is really flimsy. And back then, there were a lot of home remedies that she could have genuinely believed that this was helping the children. She could have thought it was actually something that was helpful, and it turned out that it was actually toxic, because that happened a lot. I mean, I think of how they used to put asbestos in the walls. They used to put cyanide in makeup. Is it cyanide? Can't remember what it was. But they used to put a lot of toxic things that they thought would be helpful, like drinking mercury or whatever. Like, they had these really crazy cures, and this could have been one of them, that she just thought she was helping the kids. But I don't know. The evidence is pretty flimsy on this one, and I don't know. I don't know what to think about it. I'm kind of torn. Like, it is possible that she was genuinely trying to get rid of the children, but also, why would she risk getting such deadly diseases to keep the children alive? If she knew that if she just let them be, the disease would run its course and probably kill the children anyways. So why would she risk getting so close to them for these highly contagious diseases just to try and kill them? That's a question that doesn't really make sense in my brain. But I mean, it would have been a perfect cover. Like, oh, they're sick and they just never got better. So it's hard. I'm kind of torn on this one. Is she guilty or is she not? But what do you think? Like, I really want to hear, like, what do you think? Do you think she's guilty? Do you think she's not? I don't know. I'm struggling on this one. Now, one other thing I do want to say, there's actually a rumor that if you go to the prison where she was executed and look at a very specific prison window from the outside, you can actually see Martha looking over the prison. If you go inside, you can't see her standing there. But if you're looking outside, you can see her watching the prison grounds. That her ghost haunting us because she was actually innocent? We may never know, but for now, we will go with the belief that she did actually murder her 3 stepchildren. Because based off of the information that they had at that time, they felt very strongly that she had done it and that she was evil and that she was wicked and she was the cause of their death. But I just have some serious doubts. I don't know. Was Martha a horrible human in history? Or was she actually a victim of the times that she lived in? Like I said, she was a social outcast. She didn't live the way that most women lived. And when they found out that she was living in sin, there was a lot of doubt cast upon her story because if she was living immorally, there's no way she could have been telling the truth. Then she had to be motivated by sinister means, and the evidence, like I said, it's just so sketchy. You have a story from a child who resented this woman already. And I'm not saying he lied about his throat hurting after drinking tea. It is very possible that she did genuinely kill these children. But it's a story and then some random tests that they pulled that may or may not show proof. I feel like nowadays this would all be called circumstantial evidence. There was no hard proof that she had actually murdered her stepchildren. But maybe nowadays with better testing, it would have proven that she was guilty. Sorry guys, I just keep hammering on this, but it's just because I don't know what to think. I genuinely don't know what to think. Was she actually a horrible human in history? Or was she a victim of being a rebellious woman? What do you think? I really want to hear what you guys think on this one. So make sure you comment, share your thoughts because I'm torn. I really am torn. I don't feel like I have enough proof. Like if I was on the jury, I don't think I'd be able to convict her. To be honest, I wouldn't have enough proof. It seems suspicious. It seems sketchy, but I don't know. So Martha Rendell, our horrible human in history this week. Is she horrible? Is she not? Hard to say. You let me know what you think. But next week, guys. Oh, I'm so excited. We are going to talk about one of my absolute favorite Roman emperors. And I know what you're thinking. No, it's not Caesar. And it's not Caesar. It also wasn't Caesar. But it definitely was Caesar. Are you confused? Have I confused you yet? I know. There were 12 different Caesars, in case you're curious. So it wasn't the Caesar you're thinking of. It's my favorite Caesar, who is known as Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, or for short, Caligula. Oh, I'm so excited to talk about Caligula. His story is incredible. So he ruled Rome from 37 AD to 41 AD. Notice that is not a very long time period, and there is a reason behind that, which you'll just have to find out what that reason is next week. So we are going to have so much fun talking about this crazy man and why he is such a horrible human in history. So hang on, guys. We're going to talk about Caligula next week. Again, let me know what you think about Martha Rendell in the comments. I genuinely want to hear what you guys think. Guilty, not guilty. I lean towards guilty at some moments. Some moments I lean towards not guilty, but let me know what you think. Because I genuinely am curious your guys' thoughts on her. But we will plan on seeing you guys next week on our next episode of Horrible Humans in History, where we're going to talk about Mr. Caesar Augustus Germanicus, or my favorite, Caligula. So see you next week, guys.